Hi, I'm Peter Mayrick from Partners in Ministry. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm so excited for the next in our leadership webinars. I'm joined today by Craig Farmer from Partners in Ministry New South Wales and by Annie Layton, Partners in Ministry in Victoria. Welcome guys, I'm so glad that you're both here and I'm really excited about this topic. The topic today was the second most chosen topic when we did a survey at the end of last year. What would you like us to talk about as we come into leadership and leading churches? This topic is moving from good plans to execution. We know that writing a good plan is often easy. In fact, there are lots of good plans. The greatest challenge though with plans is actually implementing them and bringing them to life. We know that it's hard for pastors to implement plans. We know that it's hard to work through volunteers and staff to get things done. I want to let you into a secret. It's hard whether you're in a church environment or whether you're in a business environment to implement plans. And so today what we want to do is unpack what it is to turn good plans into action, into execution. And so we're going to cover off 3 topics as we go through. We're going to have lots of time for asking questions. So let me encourage you to either put questions in the chat box that is here on the webinar or in the question page and we'll deal with them. We're going to stop after each of the short presentations to deal with some questions. So please feel free to give us your questions. We'd love to hear them. We're going to start though in the first topic, think about why going from ideas to implementation is so hard. And we want to explore that. Now, Craig, you're going to address that. Why is moving to implementation so hard?
Well, thanks for asking, Peter. So let's start, and so good to be with you today. Matthew 7:24 says, everyone who hears the word of mine and puts them into practice is like the wise man who built his house on the rock. That's the foundation of what we're talking about today. We don't want to just be hearers of the word, we want to be doers of the word. Now, as Peter said, there is the reality that when some research has been done, not just for church pastors, but for every leader, and asked the question, what's harder, strategy development or strategy implementation? And everyone said, I think it was like 95% said definitely implementation. Now, we know that you and I and lots of us are implementing all the time. But there's a difference between implementing for ourselves, maybe writing a sermon or planning a service, than creating implementation that is with and together with others as well. Peter Drucker once said, plans are only good intentions unless they immediately degenerate into hard work. And so as we think about what this looks like in terms of implementing our plans, we recognise that it needs to be a discipline and a culture, if you like, of not just ideation, thinking, but also doing. Now, one of the things that we know is many pastors who are attracted to ministry have a bent towards ideation, ideas. They have a bent towards one of 3 things, creating vision, communication, and whether that's preaching or in other words, or people. Now, most pastors I found have a bent towards 2 of those 3. And so what that really means is that we need to keep recognising that maybe we need to think about how to create a team around us that help us implement for ourselves. Ken Blanchard, who's the co-author of The 1 Minute Manager, said, vision just alone can't get it done. Too often we spend all of our time on vision and none on implementation. And so what this does is bring together these 2 sides of what it means to lead, leadership skills and management skills. And so as we think about this, we need to ask again our question of, is the management part of it not as attractive or not as exciting to me? Now, there's a couple of dynamics that Peter referred to. They're external dynamics, not just in us, but then there's some that Annie's going to explore that are about us, actually. So let me just give you a couple of the externals and maybe just touch in on a few of the internals that I've found and maybe you have as well. The first is that change is hard. It's hard enough to change ourselves, but to bring behavioural change in others is actually just really challenging. And implementation is actually about bringing behaviour change. And so if that's true, then we need to become really good at understanding how to help people shift their mindsets, but also their actual behaviours. Often what we find in churches is there's competing visions about what the church should be or is moving towards. And so particularly as denominational loyalties soften quite considerably, we find people coming in and into various churches and having different ideas about the vision or the philosophy of the church. And that just creates difficulty in implementing because people don't agree on the priorities or the overarching vision of it. Another one is that this is the reality, is that we go into lots of churches as a whole team regularly, and we just find that churches find it actually really hard to create a plan with clear goals that people know exactly what they are. I was teaching another leadership course earlier today, and I mentioned to this group that the reality is that most people, employees or volunteers, can't name the top 3 priorities in an organisation. And so this is why having good plans, understanding that God's the ultimate director of what we do. And Peter also mentioned that volunteers are at the heart of churches, and that's just challenging, isn't it? They have good intention, you have what you think is clear plan, but then life gets in the way. And it's just challenging to have conversations to say, but you said, when they're volunteers. And so that's just the reality that I found too. But then that moves to another one that many of us as pastors find really challenging, and that is having the difficult conversation. We find that many pastors, and I've got to include myself in this, have to really work hard to let this be okay to have the hard conversation around expectations and goals. And the last one that I would just put in here, Peter, is that for some churches and some pastors who like vision, really focused on that, then they have lots of ideas, maybe too many ideas, and it's sort of the flavour of the month. And so you can't implement if every week or every month or every year there's a different model or if a different priority or if a different way. And so we just find that Vision Sunday comes and everyone goes, yeah, rah, rah, but actually people come to think, but we're not going to do this. And so ultimately, if we don't do that which we say, credibility gets impacted, and we want people to see us as credible. Thanks, Peter.
Fantastic, mate. It's interesting as you say that. When I first started working with pastors 10 years ago, I learned really quickly that people who are trained in implementation and vision within the corporate environment, within the business environment, need to recognise that working in churches there's lots of similarities, but very, very different. Your comment about volunteers, the thing that I learnt, and I think a lot of pastors need to get this to understand why implementation is so hard. I learnt that there are kind of like 3 energy buckets, adults. So when we're talking about people over about the age of 25, there are these energy buckets that are really effective and affect the way we implement. If you think about the first energy bucket, it's a bucket that is devoted to vocation, you know. Yeah. And most of us who work in some way, whether that be paid work, voluntary work, domestic work, whatever it is, we give so much to that first bucket. We run the risk of allowing our identity to be formed by that first bucket, but it's our vocational bucket. And the truth is many of us are feeling guilty because we're not putting enough in that second bucket, which is the interpersonal family or close friends bucket. Yeah. And we feel guilty that we're giving so much to the first bucket that we're trading off on the second bucket, and we're not giving enough there. But there's a third bucket, which is like a discretional bucket, and it's where the things go that when we have spare time, we put things in that bucket. And church often fits in that bucket. But what people often don't realise is that's the same bucket where the man or the woman who's a tax accountant puts their own personal tax, and they haven't done their personal tax for 3 years. It's not that they can't do it. Yes. They just can't be bothered to get to that third bucket. And if we start to recognise that volunteers and church people, it may not be right, it's a misallocation of priorities. That's right. But there's a truth that church sits there, therefore we can't expect as much. Now the other thing that we need to then recognise is that when we work with people, say under the age of, 25, youth, young adults, those buckets are entirely different. And what you see is often their first bucket is the bucket that relates to church, because I'm fully devoted to church. In fact, many of my friendship groups come out of church, and I'll give everything there, maybe at the expense of family or interpersonal relationships. And I see the ground littered with youth leaders who become adult leaders, and they thought that they were really good because people were giving them 100% or more than 100% effort, and then suddenly they started working with adults,
Yes.
and started failing and it wasn't that they were failures.
No.
It was just they moved with a different audience.
That's right.
Now you, Craig, are very good at implementing. I'm going to assume you've been perfect your whole life at implementing. Is that a fair assumption?
You'd be absolutely wrong, Peter.
Well,
No, I haven't been good. In fact, I would say that I made a couple of fundamental mistakes because I like ideas and I like catalysing ideas. I like vision and I like energy and movement and new. And so I found myself constantly having new ideas. I was not quite the flavour of the month, but certainly I would just have, this, we could do this and we could do this. And what I didn't recognise, like you said, that discretionary bucket is smaller for many people, and it's not something that we need to beat people up about or make them feel guilty about. It's just the reality, because we want whole people and whole disciples. And so what I was expecting them to do is be as committed or have as much energy as me, but I'm working full time in that. So what I found was I had too many things on the go. And so it meant that actually I couldn't implement, and we couldn't implement as a church. And so that was the first thing. But the other thing that I found that, so I had to really simplify.
Yeah.
And that frustrates me. But you know what I found is that that's a beautiful discipleship moment for me, because I recognise that that's an impatience, and it's probably a character thing that God needed to form anew in me. And so that was challenging in my youthful exuberance. I didn't necessarily see it, but now I do see that. But the other thing that I definitely needed to get better at, and that is making not only the end state clearer. So what does good look like? You know, in 3 months or 6 months or 12 months? Because again, in my profile as in Myers-Briggs, I like just more, let's just go with the flow type, intuitive. And so I needed to learn to name it.
Yeah.
And some people I find in pastors, they find that really challenging. But the hardest bit, those two, everyone gets and understands, but the hardest bit for me really was then having the conversation and learning to lean into that and say, we agreed. What does this look like? What can we do different? And so that's the hardest bit that I find, but I think that it's well worth it because this is kingdom work.
So I'm hearing clarity there. I'm hearing clarity of what we're choosing. You said simplify it, and I guess on the back of COVID, that's even more important because we can do less. We've got even shallower energy buckets going on. Everyone's tired. So clarity down to what's important. But you're saying clarity, what would good look like? I love that.
That's right.
Wow. Folks, we want to say we understand that this is a hard area.
That's right.
We also understand that it's even harder as in the stage in life that we're in. If we're over in Perth, we're dealing with COVID strongly now.
That's right.
On the eastern states, we're still not back 100%.
No.
But the energy levels are down. Let's move on. Let's go to Annie, because Annie's going to explore for us the resistance to the execution mindset. Annie, can you tell us more about this resistance and what's going on, and then we'll move into how we can deal with it well. Over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, great to be with you all here in freezing old Victoria. So it's great to be here talking about this conversation because as Craig beautifully explained, there are external dynamics, but there are also internal. And we do have resistance. So in the next few minutes as I share, I'd like for you to wrestle and have this curiosity about what might be the resistances in you to execution. So it's the if not, why not piece. In other words, what is the resistance about in us that's impacting me in executing? So Stephen Pressfield says this, and he wrote this great book called The War of Art. The more important a call to action is to our soul's evolution, the more resistance we will feel about answering it. But to yield to resistance deforms our spirit. It stunts us and makes us less than we are and were born to be. And the Apostle Paul puts it this way in Romans 7:15, and you guys all know this scripture. For what I'm doing, I do not understand. For I'm not practicing what I would like to do, but I'm doing the very things I hate. So think about your resistance to execution. What do you imagine resistance might be about? Well, I'd like to offer 3 mindsets that I believe create resistance for execution in us. And they are fear, lack, and grief. Let's start with fear. Fear's role in creating resistance could look like in us Firstly, a fear of failure. So many things just haven't worked and it's been crushing, and we've all been there. Maybe it's a fear of success. We have imposter syndrome. Deep down, we don't believe we have the capacity to execute. It's a competence or confidence issue. Perhaps it's a fear of poor performance. We're perfectionists. If it's not perfect, we're not going to do it. And we can veil perfectionism behind the idea of excellence, but it is out of fear. Maybe if we're really honest, at times we've even been embarrassed or maybe a little bit angry at what we or our churches have delivered in the past. Or maybe it's a fear of other stakeholders. Perhaps we have fear of the ramifications if we implement something that contravenes the they's opinions and theologies. They could be a key board member, a key elder, a key giver, or maybe even our spouse. So that's fear. Sometimes lack or scarcity can be another mindset that creates resistance to execution. It could be a lack of fruit in the past. There was no bang for buck. The results just did not equal the effort. Perhaps it's a lack of motivation. We're just exhausted, or we've resigned to the posture that nothing ever changes. Maybe we're on the brink of burnout. COVID has had a lot to answer for and how we find ourselves right now in 2022. Perhaps there was a lack of inspiration. You need ideas and help, but you're unsure what to do next. Maybe it's in a lack of the right people that can create resistance to execution. We all know that sometimes faithful, available people doesn't always equal skilled people. And a lack or scarcity mindset can be indicative of leading out of what we would call an orphan spirit. We can strive or strangle or clasp our projects, clasp our churches and our people. It can be a mindset that has us withholding rather than releasing finances, releasing our authority to others, even releasing staff. That orphan mindset can manifest as workaholism, competitiveness, the Goldilocks syndrome, which I like to call, which is like it's never enough. We can helicopter leadership, we can refuse to delegate. All that leadership behaviour can be as a result of an orphan or scarcity lack mindset and can prevent us from executing. Thirdly, we can have a grief mindset that can create resistance to execution. Sadly, it's been said that ministry is a series of ungrieved losses. Leadership can have a disproportionate number of losses. People we invest in leave, staff move on, or they don't work out. Betrayals happen, relationships shatter. Our own family can get impacted by grief or loss caused by ministry. And sadly, losses that are not grieved accumulate in our soul and can prevent us from living freely and honestly with God and others. Peter Scazzero says this: a refusal to embrace our sorrows and grieve them fully condemns us and our churches to shallow spirituality that blocks the work of the Holy Spirit in us. It contributes to the overall sense of superficiality in our churches and a lack of profound compassion. Pretty sad stuff, hey? So I'm wondering, could grief be unconsciously impacting our execution of our plans? Maybe we believe we don't have the luxury or the time or the capacity or even the courage to go there and allow ourselves to grieve. So could grief be holding us back from executing? Could we be stuck or heart-locked? Could we be living from a death-loss posture rather than living from a resurrection and new life-based posture? Remember, the seed has to die first before it then sprouts. Mark E. Green, he's the CEO of Media Brain and an expert in execution. He believes there are three responses we have when required to execute or commit to something. He believes, one, there's denial and inaction. That's when we do the ostrich thing and we bury our head. Two, response, we can go to our known comfort zones once there. And then when we go to that comfort zone, we can medicate, distract, or numb. And the third response we can do is do the hard right thing. And whilst that can be painful to birth something, it is birth with a pain with purpose, so to speak. So all of you ladies watching this who have had children, you know what it's like to birth something when there's pain for a purpose. However, inaction can also bring pain. Inaction can cause shame, condemnation, and discouragement in us. So there can be pain from action versus pain from inaction. And the American minister Joyce Meyer likes to say, and she puts this well, there's the pain of growing versus the pain of not growing. Pick your pain. So pain is supposed to move us towards something. Just hold your finger over a candle and you'll see this law in action. Whilst direction is pain moving you to, what direction is pain moving you towards? It can move you forward, to do the hard right thing. It can keep you stuck, like the denial, as Mark talks about, or it can cause you to retreat, which is going to the known comfort zone. You know, it was interesting, a friend of mine who was an Australian pastor, a really successful church, actually, a Pentecostal church. One day he surprisingly quit. And when I asked him why, he said he was simply sick of being an events director. We have all had those moments when we stare out our office windows and wonder how our desire to love people and share the good news of the gospel has ended up necessitating that we are leaders that have to be competent CEOs, you know, with innovative strategy and successful in executing and embedding new programs. We sort of have those moments, you know, and whilst I have been there myself and I totally get it, the nature of leading a faith community does call upon us to develop this leadership requirement of execution and embedding. So apart from like a healthy reframe around those window wanderings, we do need to sometimes put on our big girl or our big boy pants and ask ourselves the question when it comes to resistance. If not, why not? And be prepared to engage with the answers. So as I finish this section, I'd just like to leave you with a couple of questions about resistance. Can you think of an area in your world right now where there is resistance? Because that resistance is pointing the way to something that you need to engage with. What do you imagine that resistance is about? If resistance could talk, what would it be saying? Could fear, lack, or grief be impacting your capacity to execute? So I will leave you with those questions and I will hand you back to Peter. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you, Annie. Great food for thought and really challenging. I wonder where people are at with those questions. By the way, if you have any questions for Annie or Craig, please jot them down and we'll get to them if we have time through today. We've got a special Q&A section today in this hour. Annie, there's a question I want to ask you. What's one way to recognise when we're leading with fear?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if we're aware of unhealthy attachments, so they could be to things like power, approval, control, or comfort. So those unhealthy attachments are like a kind of a clue or to the fact that there's something that fear is informing in our heart, a place where God needs to be. So we kind of need to ask ourselves when we feel that fear of executing, if our current circumstance is part of God's plan to develop us, what is he up to? Sometimes God in his sovereignty allows us to be in situations that he could easily remedy with his power, right? But God has an upgrade for both our identity and our leadership available if we choose to give him control. It's a matter of being aware of this attachment to some of those unhealthy things that are informed by fear. Yeah.
Thank you, Annie. Craig, we all know that leadership is challenging. It's really hard to get churches moving and get that plant moving. Do you have any ideas on how we could start building momentum? So many low-hanging fruit, or just creating momentum for a church?
Yeah, sure. But before I say that, I just want to, how good was what Annie said? Because what she helps us to recognise is that there's a whole bunch of resistances or blockages that we need to own and recognise is not just a techniques issue. It's a formation. Yeah. And I just love that, how she helped us think through that. Because what I'm going to share is very much a technique. And then later what I'm going to share you is techniques. But I want to just say to folks, hey, it's both. It's not just get the good technique, but as Annie said so beautifully, there needs to be potentially some reflection. So I'd say there's just one very simple way to get some momentum. Yeah. Go ask 5 volunteers that you really trust and say to them, so what's one thing that maybe we could change or annoys you, or you think we could or should improve? Just tell me. And then just see if there's an aggregate, if there's maybe 3 or 4 of them, and then go ahead and do that. Now, if you really want to get momentum, do that 3 times. And if you can do that, then people go, hey, 1, so he listens or she listens. Yeah. But 2, they see movement. They see, so that's shifted and that's shifted and that's shifted. And not only do you get credibility, but now people are more likely to say, yes, I'm going to keep moving forward. And so that's my, I guess, very quick win way.
That's genius, brother. That is just absolute genius. I keep on getting reminded that the stuff that is good in the business world often comes from our textbook, the scriptures. James 3 has that wonderful piece about wisdom. You could say wisdom in leadership, but it starts off that 3:13 about humility etc. But as you get to that verse 17, it's got a list of capabilities or things that would be an outworking of Christian leadership. And one in the middle of it, the NIV doesn't say it so well, but the ESV says open to reason, which is exactly what you're doing, is you're having the humility to say, hey, do you know what we should do? I reckon that takes real maturity.
It does.
And as you say, so therefore it starts in formation.
Yeah.
It starts in having confidence that it's okay for others to be right, it's okay to learn. It's amazing how it all keeps coming back to maturity in Christ, doesn't it?
And it's fascinating is that people in the congregation, they're talking already.
Yeah, they are.
They're saying, oh, I can't believe this happened or that happened or that. And they're often very small things. It might be the length of the service, or it might be, whatever. Now, some will come bravely and tell us, but often they don't. And so we don't get the sense of what are the pain points, but also what are the opportunities.
Yeah. And it takes a mindset of saying, actually, I want to be open to these things, rather than this is a critique of me.
That's right.
That's really hard to do, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Annie, I wonder from you, what are some practical ways then to deal with this fear in leadership that you talked about? Have you got any ideas?
Yeah, sure. Look, I wish we had a whole day for this. Hey, I think we've got so much to say.
We might be able to organise that.
Craig. Yeah, that's right. That's the next thing, big workshop day. Look, there's so many things we could touch on, but super briefly, I think working with those fear triggers. So when you feel that fear being triggered in you, engaging with it. Brene Brown, who many of you probably know now, she's a shame researcher, particularly in the area of vulnerability. She has this great map that she uses, and she calls it the 3 R's. It's the reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution. Easy to remember. I love it, the 3 R's. And there's this idea that when something gets triggered in you, there's a reckoning that happens. So you feel that trigger come up, that fear trigger, and you go, right, and you reckon with it, and you discern the fact that you've had a response to something. So, for example, you're in the doorway of church saying goodbye to everybody, and Mr. Brown comes up and he hits you up about, vaccinations, opinions, whatever it is. And you sense that feeling rise in you where you'd like to lay hands on him, but not in prayer. Those moments where you go, whoa, and what was that? That was a real response. That's what we call the reckoning. So we engage with that. We go, right, there's a trigger here in fear. Right, I'm going to reckon with that because there's something coming up in me that's not good. Then we rumble with it. So we rumble with that response that's coming from a not great place. So the rumble, as we wrestle with it, we go, okay, where have I felt this feeling before? How might my past be informing that feeling? Where is that informing my present from my past? And we do the work with that rumble, and we critically reflect. What's informing this? Where have I been here before that's causing me to have the response I'm having? Particularly in the area of fear. And then the third thing that Brene's saying is the idea of this revolution. It's learning to do the interior work that next time we get triggered by Mr. Brown or whoever it is, we'll respond differently because we've done the work in our interior world around that trigger. So the practical way to deal with fear is to engage with the triggers as there is a gift of restoration and wholeness behind them. And as Craig beautifully said, formation as well. Secondly, a great way to do is interrogate our fear. So ask ourselves, hey, I've got this fear. What might the assumption be that's generating it? What's the data that supports it? How might I test that conclusion that I'm making up in my head? How probable or permanent is that worst case scenario? Interrogate the fear that's preventing us from executing the ideas. And thirdly, let's reframe or flip that fear that we have that's coming up. So ask ourselves, for example, I'd ask myself, Annie, if I wasn't afraid, how would the brave Annie turn up? So we can flip or reframe the very fear that's triggering us. That's a couple of ideas there, yeah.
I love it. How would the brave Annie turn up? Well, what a confronting... Can I use that? Hey, Peter, how would the brave Annie turn up? What would Annie do? I'm pretty sure that would be a helpful thing.
That'd be so good, because she might be even braver than brave Peter.
I think she might be.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you, Annie. We might go... I want to remind you, folks, if you've got any questions, please put them in the question box. We'd love to deal with them. We'll keep dealing with questions as we go through. But before we do, I'm going to go back to you, Craig.
Sure.
Now we want to think about activation.
Yeah.
And moving into activating plans. How do we do that?
Yeah. So firstly, let me just, as we think about this, James 1:22, do not merely be listeners of the word and so deceive yourself. I think that's so interesting. Do what it says. And so this is just, it's a corporate issue, implementation, but it's also a personal issue, you know? And so let's just continue to make it both. So what I'm going to share with you comes from a book called The 4 Disciplines of Execution. And I just want to put that out there. It's a great book, very simple. And let me just go through the 4 points. Now, if you want cheat sheets, and if you want to email us at the end of this, I can send you the executive summary if you'd like. So you never know. Because I'm only going to headline it. I'm not going to go into the detail.
We'll give people the email at the end.
That's right, yeah. So here's the 4. So the first step, if you're going to implement, go from idea to execution, is getting really clear about the wildly important goal that you have. Now, here's what we know. We've got what we call the whirlwind. So the whirlwind is the Sunday comes up, sermon preparation, people to meet. It's the stuff that you've got to do every day in ministry. It's just, it always is there. But what a wildly important goal says is, if everything else stayed the same and we were to improve or achieve blah, whatever blah is, then our church or our ministry would keep moving forward. What's that? And what we need to do is make the space. And so if we say the whirlwind is 80%, we need to make space for 20%. Now here's what typically we do, and this is certainly what I did, Peter, and I said it earlier, is we make too many goals. Here's what we know. If we have, say, 11 or 10 goals, the likelihood of achieving all 10 is 0. Yeah. I want you to realise that. Not just you just won't do it, because you can't do something like that with excellence. So what we know is if there's between 4 to say 8, then you're going to hit a few of them, 2 or 3, and the rest of them, they'll be put on the side. So the idea here is to choose 1 or 2 for a period of time that you're just going to say, this is our wildly important goal for this period of time. Now, it might be 90 days or 6 months, but you're going to just choose, this is what we want to do to move this forward. So it might be integration. You might say, you know what, as a church, we know that we can do better here. Now we're going to run everything that we normally do, but we're going to focus in. And what does it look like? And so the wildly important goal says, currently this, by this. So what I mean by it might be currently, 50% of new visitors are followed up within a week. Well, what we now want to do is we want 100% of new visitors or visitors being followed up within a week. And not by the minister, but by someone in the lay person. So that's just getting really crystal clear about that. Whirlwind, it's going to happen all the time, and you can't escape it. But there's creating the space for the wildly important. Is that making sense?
Now you've penetrated into the whirlwind to make something happen.
That's right.
Because the whirlwind in a pastor's life is so much greater.
Oh,
suddenly
massive.
there's a funeral. Yeah. Suddenly someone's got a problem.
That's
You've
right.
got to drop everything to deal with it.
Exactly.
We get that. So it may even be that in a church life, we need to have fewer wildly important goals than might be in a normal business.
Well, actually, it's not different.
Yeah, right.
So 1 or 2 tops.
Yeah. I get
and
that.
So the second one, so the first one is create wildly important goals that say, here's what we're aiming at for this period of time, and this is what good looks like.
Yep.
So the second is to think about what's the measure. Now, some of people are going to get a bit nervous now, right? But what we call a lead measure. So let me use lead and lag as as the terms here. So a lag measure is how much money went into the plate or how many people came to the service. Yep. So that's a lag measure. The lead measure, though, is a measure that says if we do this, it's something we can control, something we can influence, and it's more likely to help us move towards that WIG, that wildly important goal. So again, let me use that same example. So let's say I want 100% of people to be followed up within a week. So a lead measure, what's the lead measure? I know. What about, I say to my volunteer team, hey, so what we can do is make phone calls, as an example.
Yep.
And so what I could actually track is how many phone calls did people make? Now this sounds really, a bit, but what happens is that people say, oh, so we're taking this seriously.
Yeah.
Because you know what, people, we love them and we want to see them enter into our community of faith and know Jesus and be discipled. So we want to take this seriously. So that's the second, is think about what are the ways in which we can know whether we're making progress. So that's the essence of it. The third one is just as you're thinking about that, you're tracking these things and you're having conversations together to say, how are we going? And so as a ministry team or as a volunteer team, whoever it might be, we're not just hoping, we're actually taking these things seriously. And so the difference between good idea to implementation is to say, what's it going to take for us to A, know what we're aiming at, B, what are the behaviours that we want to ask people to do, 3, tracking those in some appropriate way, and 4 is then just having conversations saying, how are we going against this? And so the last bit is the hardest bit, I think, because people are busy in the whirlwind. But if you can just bring people together once a term, once a month, whatever is appropriate, and just say, how are we going? And then people can say, yeah, I'm doing okay with that measure. And so here is what next looks like. You know, I'm going to do this next.
But I love that, mate, because what's actually going on there, when you evaluate and you manage consequences of that evaluation, you're actually saying, yes, this was important.
That's right.
So you're again cutting into the whirlwind again to say this was important enough to focus on.
That's right.
Some people will ask in the question, you know, lead and lag measures. Lead measures they might refer to as inputs as well, the things we do.
Sure.
And lag measures are the outcomes or outputs.
That's exactly right.
But we should measure if we're serious about stewarding the resources we have. It's just stewardship, isn't it?
Absolutely, Peter. And the other thing I would add is that one of the things I got better at later on was asking the question about, so do we want to do whatever this is? You know, yes, that's right. We need to, focus in on youth ministry for the next 12 months or whatever it might be. Okay, so what does good look like? Yep, good. Okay, looks like that. Now, you will also have to be really careful that there's God's work and our work.
Yeah.
We need to be careful not to confuse those. So often churches have a conversion metric, Yes. I go, well, that's God's work, And so what's my work? Well, my work might be preaching the gospel or presenting the gospel. So I could measure or say, I want to go and, we used to have a thing of, we want to go and visit so many people that don't know Jesus a month. And so we knew that's what we could influence, But the other thing that I often, I got better at was saying to folk, so what are we going to do or how are we going to manage it if we don't?
Yeah.
Like if I said I would do something and I don't do that, how are we going to have that conversation? Or if we miss that measure or that target, because people get scared about making targets because they wonder, am I going to get in trouble or am I going to sense a failure? No, it's only there so that we can aim at something.
Yeah.
And so, but having that open conversation about that creates a sense of ownership and reduces pressure. We don't want pressure. We don't want guilt. We want a sense of grace, but we also want a sense of that we're in kingdom work.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's important stuff.
Yeah.
It's interesting you chose that conversion metric, because it's funny how when you've got no metric, you don't measure it, there's very lack of intent.
Yeah.
I led a group of ministers in a roundtable conversation for a while, and they didn't want to measure conversions because, again, it's sovereignty of God, it's
That's
God's
right.
job.
Yeah.
And it was embarrassing to say 0 every quarter.
Sure.
And so we started saying, well, actually, what would we do if we wanted to see God at work? What would be our inputs?
That's right.
And it's funny how 5% is a target. So a church of 100 wanted to see 5 people in the year.
Yeah.
How actually, when you became intentional, you actually saw that happen without too much fuss.
Yes.
When you understood we can do these things.
Yes.
God's in control.
That's right.
Oh, fantastic, mate. I'm really excited here. I've got a question here. How do you go engaging everyday staff with less corporate experience, is the insinuation, with the taking up and adhering with this model?
So, fundamentally, I think this is a vision issue.
Yeah.
So, if I really believe in the kingdom work and we're in this together, then what happens is that people put that third bucket, discretionary effort, where they sense God's call, God's equipping, and God's encouragement. And so, as a leader, I think one of our jobs is to help people really come in contact with God's call in their life and the kingdom work that they're being invited to join into. And so I think fundamentally, because it's discretionary effort they're giving us, that's the reality. Yeah.
Thank you, mate. I've got a question here from Brian. just want you to repeat the disciplines again. You said I missed the third
Sure.
and fourth discipline. I think there were 3 disciplines.
There's
you
4.
mentioned.
There's
oh,
4.
there were 4,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. Brian, thank you. Let me tell you again. So first, help clarify the wildly important goal. What's that? That's the first one. The second is identify what's the steps that need to be used or done in order to reach those. So, and these are the things, like Peter said, what is our inputs? What can we do in a proactive, influenceable way? So, I won't go into more detail. Third is somehow track that. How are we going with this? And which includes the fourth one, which is the actual conversation, the meeting, whatever you want to do. But at some level, do you know, there's a way, if I use a sports analogy, Peter, it might be helpful. So I don't know about you, but I played sport all my life. And so sometimes we'd be, playing soccer or basketball or whatever. No one's keeping score. And it's a very different game as soon as someone starts keeping score.
Isn't it?
Now, some of that's not healthy, I'm sure.
You didn't play with me.
Well, I'm a pretty competitive bloke, and so I suspect we both are. But the point being here is that when we have some visual that says we're on track, and churches typically aren't great at this, and because they feel like it's, I don't know, corporate or it's whatever. And I get it. I'm not saying we need to do it in the same way. I'm just saying that which is important, God counts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of demonstrations of that in the scriptures.
That's right.
Eddie, why don't you save us from our sporting bravado here? Listen, there's a question here. Wildly important goals, or WIGs, often find themselves expressed in economic or satisfaction or attendance terms. And so clearly we need to be careful under God as we do this. What do we need to watch out for as we start looking for goals?
Yeah, look, I think there's such a temptation when you've got so many different directions you can go with your goals to try and hit some in every area. And look, Craig has talked about this already, this idea of not having lots and lots. But I think even having too many from too many different areas can also make it very congested in the vision, as we've talked about at the church, picking up the vision and running with it. And I don't have a sport illustration, I have a makeup illustration.
A makeup illustration.
Let me off with that.
You say makeup?
Makeup. So back many, many years ago, a long time ago when I was an intern pastor, I actually worked for a cosmetic company. And we used to actually stock about 9 red lipsticks. And if someone would come to the counter, we'd only ever show them 2, because what we'd find is the more they tried on different lipsticks, their hands would be covered, but they got really confused. And quite often they'd end up not buying anything and walk away. It was just way too much to onboard in their heart or what they wanted to. It was just, they're overwhelmed, put it that way. So I think this idea of the WIGs being some in financial, some in operational, some in congregational stuff, for the average punter, it's just too much.
Yeah.
So again, just have 1 or 2 areas that you cover off. And that way they can apply and implement that and buy into that. They're not overwhelmed. And in that case, just walk away from the whole thing. So that's my little offering around the sport analogy. There's a makeup analogy. Also, I think we need to watch out that we don't abort too early. I think sometimes we get impatient with the results aren't, happening like that.
Yeah.
We can abort the execution process, or we abort because we have a failure. And it's just one failure. But the process is solid. Maybe the results are just not what I wanted or expected, but they might have been exactly what God wanted.
Yeah.
So, it might be one failure that you think is a failure, but it's not a failure at all in the kingdom economy of God. And I love this, Scott Fitzgerald said this, never confuse a single defeat with a final defeat. It's important to remember, because sometimes failures can be the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning, depending which way you look at it. So be aware of those failures and not getting taken out or aborting because of them. Because sometimes even one failure can offer a clue, like a prophetic arrow, that sort of direct us or realign us to the direction we should be going when we might have gone in a direction that wasn't perhaps for our church or for us. So our failure can realign us or our context, where we can go, okay, maybe that wasn't exactly the right goal, but if I move it over this way, repoint it that way, and I might have more success. So let's not shy away from that, because sometimes being scared to fail means we're so risk averse that we don't step out at all. So let's embrace some of those failures and see that they could be a clue to perhaps push into a brand new cutting edge frontier rather than sit in yesterday's ideas, because yesterday's ideas or yesterday's matter is full of worms, right?
Yeah.
We want something that's fresh and new and prophetic for today. So let's take things that they don't have to work. Maybe just need to realign and go, our context might not have been right, or we were shoehorning into this, but it wasn't a fit for our church. So let's not be afraid to fail or be taken out by one or two failures. Let's let them realign us and maybe push us forward into something new and fresh that we might not have considered before.
Thank you, Annie. Yeah. I want to come back to you in a moment on the question of perfectionism, but before we do, Craig, it seems to me in execution and measurement, one of the greatest dangers for measurement is to recognise that we are not what we measure. What we measure are the things we want to steward. We think they're important enough to measure. But one of the dangers in ministry is to think that we are that achievement. Our identity is tied up in measurements, and it's a great danger for pastors in particular to allow themselves to think this is how good I am or how bad I am by these measurements. You got anything to say to that?
Oh, 100% agree with that, Peter. And I think Annie, what she was sharing about that internal work is really important. I guess a couple of things that I would say. One is that you never, there's a famous rugby league coach who says, you're never going as good as everyone says or never as bad as everyone says. I won't say whose name is because I don't want to be partisan here. But I think that there's an aspect where if our identity is somehow caught up in this, and the reality is that most of us in our roles of whatever, whether in the church or beyond, there always is some aspect of that. But we need to just continually let God and his sense of identity for us be the main thing. And that's, if we've got that, then as Annie said, and I was thinking about John Maxwell's book, Failing Forward, and his way of putting it. And that's exactly what you're able to do, aren't you? When you can keep trying. But when you've got the opposite, when there's a sense of insecurity or whatever it might be, then you're looking across and you're looking around and there's a competitiveness and there's a comparison. And that's one of my triggers. One of the things that I noted is if I was, feeling like, oh, that church down the road or whatever, they're doing that, oh, that looks attractive, that looks good, something I need to attend to, like Andy said so helpfully. So those are just really helpful for me to recognise, yes, we need to be true to our call and our convictions. And that's what I would say an eldership or a board or a ministry staff needs to go back and just continually say, so what are our convictions about ministry, about God, about his word, and how God's calling us in this place. Because from that security, both it's not just about you, the pastor, the minister, it's about us, the people.
As you say, having someone you're accountable to as a pastor, as a church leader, who asks those questions and reminds you that your identity is not that.
That's right.
Your identity is in Christ. Our ministry partners, that's a key part of what they do, isn't it? As they walk beside church leaders, is to help them to reflect on that. Annie, I want to come back to the topic of perfectionism because I see this a lot, and I was reading a book recently that I think put it beautifully. Ministers in general, or church leaders in general, we want to do things perfectly because we see that we want to serve the Lord as best we can. But perfectionism gets to a point where we do things well, which is good enough and effectiveness, and then it moves into a law of diminishing returns. And if we keep pushing to be perfect, we're actually the wasted effort. Have you got anything more to say about perfectionism? I know we don't have enough time to cover a lot, but it was one of the topics that you opened up. Do you want to say anything about perfectionism?
Oh, look, again, I think you probably need a whole day for that one too. Yeah, I think it's this sense of, it's the never enoughness thing as well. It speaks to the very core identity, right, of a journey of going from someone, from unredemption to a journey with Jesus. This understanding that in our core sense, the accusations that we're not enough, that will never be enough. And as we become followers of Jesus, we know we become unconditionally loved. We're seen and we are known by God, and no matter what we do or we don't do, we're loved. But I think the core issue with humanity is that we're always striving to be accepted. And I think what Craig made a good point too around if we KPI everything and our identity sits in that, invariably we do have a point where it doesn't work and it fails. So it seems to then feed into that same idea. It seems to underscore, yeah, you're right, you didn't quite make it there. So it's that fear, it's that fear that sits underneath the perfectionism, which is always reciting the same message. So once we learn to fail and be willing to fail, I think that begins to drop off, and that we are not our ideas. And that's something I think we've talked about, maybe not today, but when you have a brain trust or some sort of collegial group of people that you meet with, that you give permission to, that are not yes people, because sometimes we can tend to hire or invite people that are the same as us. But if you have a brain trust or a group of colleagues who have the invitation to perhaps disagree with us, or say, you know what, that area there, I don't think that was working. It's really good because we learn to disassociate from the ideas and go, I'm not my idea. I'm a loved, unconditionally championed son and daughter of God. Yeah. However, that idea sucks. So, you know, it's this idea where we can securely offer things to this brain's trust and trust that their heart is all about the kingdom growing to its best, rather than having to nurse them. They have that insecure personalities, and if I dare to criticize her idea, she'll get defensive and all that stuff. So I think it's putting those relationships, as you mentioned, that can speak into our world, but also setting ourselves up to have people in our world that can offer constructive feedback. And that's what constructive is it constructs. When feedback is constructive, it constructs towards something. But it has to be in a place where we don't own those ideas as our identity, that there's something we offer up, but they are not us. And that way, that tends to eliminate that need to be perfect, to be accepted and to be loved, because we are unconditionally loved, as we know, through Jesus. And that needs to be enough for us.
Yeah, thank you.
So good. So can I just add something else to that? Because my dad, many years ago, when I was about 18 or 19, so Dad was the Bible college principal for many years, and he said, Craig, I'm not that good a leader, you know. And I went, really? And as he said this, you know, as an 18-year-old, I thought, I think something important's coming. And he said, I'm not that good. I just get people who are better than me around me and let them free and let them go. And the longer I've gone, I realised how true that really was, and how secure you need to be, like Annie said so beautifully. Because if we're going to implement, if we're going to go from good plans, many of the pastors that we're talking with today are brilliant ideation, brilliant at vision, brilliant at communication. What they may not always be as brilliant at, and I'm putting myself in this, is the actual management piece of leadership. Yeah. And so that's why you create a team, like Annie said, and not just as of advisors, but of actioners. Yes. And I had, I was blessed with a couple of just brilliant people, PAs and others, who would just say, enough, Craig, no more ideas. Or they would say to me, yes, but how? And so that was brilliant, because that would help me just to go from the idea to the vision, because there is an aspect where you can almost have spiritual ADHD, you know, where you just go, oh yeah, and this and this and this, particularly if there's a smorgasbord approach to ministry. And so you've got to have that people around you who can say, enough, Craig, and here's what we need to do to make this happen day in, day out. As it says, you've got to go from good idea to hard work. Yeah. And that's why it takes a long time, and that's why Annie said so helpfully, you know, sometimes you just got to keep persisting so that it can take root. Yeah.
Often when you do something the first time and it doesn't work, or it does work, people don't invite their friends to it. People don't get involved heavily, because actually they're waiting for confidence in the whatever it is then get involved later on. So if you're someone who lurches from the first time to the first time to the first time, you'll find that people are exhausted and no one gets involved, because they're actually waiting to have something they're confident in.
That's right.
So the failure that Annie talked about, that's so important. Both of you said it, but it's amazing how it takes enormous confidence to have humility. Yeah. It takes enormous confidence in who I am under God, whose identity I am. I'm loved by Christ, to actually say, oh yeah, actually it's okay for me not to have all the ideas.
And self-awareness.
And self-awareness.
So what Andy was talking about was self-awareness. And I'm just reflecting on a time in my church, and we were talking about, I can't even remember what the project was that we were going to, this new ministry, and I said to the staff that, you know, there was about 10 of us in the room, and I said, do you know what, I know that I probably should take the lead, like I felt the internal pressure, but I don't think I am, because I don't think I'm really good at this. And everyone in the room laughed, Peter. Like, they all laughed.
Because they all knew.
And they all knew. It's just me that didn't know. Or at least hadn't admitted to myself. And so when I did that, two things happened. One, better people than me got involved, and it actually happened. But two, they didn't have to play politics around me and worry, how are we going to get Craig out of this? Because he's really not that good at this. And so having both confidence but also this self-awareness. And you know, for me, that maybe took longer than other people. Yeah.
You should have done a 360, mate.
I should have.
That's a note for the 360s we have here. We love delivering them and helping you with your self-awareness. I'm reminded again also of, as both of you were speaking, we talk about confidence and humility, but you've spoken several times about the people in the church. You know, I reckon we're drawing from the scriptures there. You know, Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, Paul writes very, very clearly about the body. I want to let all church leaders into a secret that we know. We know that the senior pastor's role requires that much competence, and we know that you've been equipped with that much, or that much, or that much. The thing that I love when we get to work with pastors is sometimes we're the only people that they allow themselves to be vulnerable to, and to say, hey, you know what, I don't think I'm good at that. I want to say to every church leader, it's okay not to know that whole kit and caboodle. We all know that. It's just, it's sometimes very, very hard to admit, and we want to help you if we can with that. I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this has been helpful for you. We're going to leave this up on our website next week so that you can relook at it if you want. If you can't remember those 4 steps, please do, the four disciplines. Please come back and watch it. Please send it to your friends. We'd love to be able to help them as well. Here at Partners in Ministry, our aim is to support church leaders so that you can be more effective as you lead your church under God. We recognise that leading churches is a challenging thing. We recognise that most church leaders weren't trained in leadership, management skills, as well as theological discernment. And so we are here to walk with you. We've got 21 ministry partners across this country, across Australia that is, and they are set up to walk beside you. That's our job, males and females from different denominations. Please do check us out. We recognise that at this point in time, many of you will be opening up your NCLS results, your National Church Life Survey results. At the end of July, you'll be getting your full results. We'd love to help you, if that would be helpful, to walk through them so that you can practice with us how you might deliver that to others, or to give you some advice on what it says to us. We'd love to help you. We will also, in the second half of the year, be running training courses on some of the skills that are required for leadership and management. We just want to help you, so please do look out for us. You can contact us through our email address, which is info at partnersinministry.com, or you can contact us through our website, which is www.partnersinministry.com. Please do send us a message. Thank you for your thanks on the screen. We really, really appreciate them. We're very, very grateful. I want to say thank you to Craig, mate. I really enjoyed what you've had to say today. I'm pretty sure people have found it useful. Annie, thanks for coming on. We're so glad that you joined us from Melbourne. Again, thank you so much. Friends, I want to remind you, please do relook at this video when it comes up online. It'll be on our website at www.partnersinministry.com. Until then, thanks so much. If we can help you in any way, please don't hesitate to give us a call or an email. May God be with you.